January 20th, 2010. The Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., and a sterile clinic in Syracuse, New York. In the capital, federal prosecutors are signing a $24 million settlement agreement. Meanwhile, in Syracuse, the scene is horrific. Children are physically strapped to papoose boards to prevent them from struggling while unanesthetized root canals are performed. The waiting room is packed to standing room only. The air smells of cheap fluoride and metallic blood. Dentists race from chair to chair. They are not acting as medical professionals, they are line workers on a factory floor. The urgency is dictated by daily production reports printed on dot matrix printers, spitting out quotas mandated by corporate headquarters. This is the zenith of the Small Smiles dental roll-up scandal. The local business you trust has become a leveraged financial product. Holding companies are generating record-breaking earnings on paper, commanding multi-billion-dollar enterprise valuations, while their actual free cash flow is structurally negative. The paradox is absolute. How does a local dentist office become a weapon of mass financial destruction? It starts with the math. Internal emails from management to clinic dentists, unsealed during the federal investigation, read like orders from a ruthless floor boss. "You need to increase your daily production," one regional manager writes. "We are missing our targets. Do whatever it takes to get the numbers up." Another memo explicitly dictates that dentists must maintain a quota of converting at least 50% of child Medicaid patients into lucrative stainless steel crown procedures. This is the exact moment the corporate practice of medicine became a systemic financial threat. The private equity sponsors needed to squeeze every dime from these local clinics to service their crushing debt loads. If you are watching this, you are likely part of the minority who wants to look past the sanitized press releases and see the real gears of the financial machine. Hitting subscribe joins you with the few who understand how the system actually operates. The executives pushing these quotas were not doctors. They were financial engineers who discovered a regulatory blind spot, and they were just getting started. The mechanism they used to bypass the law is known as the Management Services Organization. Most states have corporate practice of medicine laws that strictly prohibit non-doctors from owning medical, dental, or veterinary practices. To get around this, the private equity firm sets up a shell company. The local doctor retains 100% legal equity of their professional corporation, but they sign a 20-year, ironclad, exclusive contract with the private equity-owned management group. The management group then sweeps 100% of the net profits upward as a management fee. It is a one-way valve directly to a Cayman-domiciled master fund. Think of it like a landlord who suddenly tells a tenant they now own everything the tenant produces inside the apartment. The local clinic is starved of capital expenditures, supply chains are heavily centralized to the point of failure, and local pricing for basic services is hiked by 20 to 40%. The business is financially thriving in the private credit markets, while operationally bleeding to death on Main Street. The Syracuse clinic settlement was a disaster for the children involved, resulting in executives being permanently barred from federal healthcare programs. But on Wall Street, this was not viewed as a cautionary tale. It was viewed as a proof of concept. The underlying financial math had worked beautifully before the regulators showed up. The private equity managers had successfully extracted their fees long before the enterprise collapsed under the weight of Medicaid fraud. Other firms looked at the wreckage and realized the model just needed to be applied to less scrutinized targets. Unregulated targets. They looked at your local veterinarian, your local funeral home, and the neighborhood emergency room. The factory floor blueprint was completely viable, provided you could inject enough leverage into the system to cover up the operational decay. The real magic trick was not the medical billing. It was a completely legal accounting loophole that could turn a $50 million acquisition into a $100 million valuation overnight. A trick known as multiple arbitrage. August 3rd, 2015. a generic glass-walled conference room in a midtown Manhattan valuation firm. The whiteboard is covered in enterprise multipliers. In private markets, small companies trade at lower valuation multiples than large companies because they are considered riskier and less liquid. A private equity sponsor establishes a holding company. They purchase a large platform veterinary practice for 10x earnings. If it generates $5 million in earnings, the valuation is $50 million. Then, the holding company executes a stealth roll-up. They acquire 20 local mom-and-pop bolt-on clinics. Because these are small businesses, they are purchased for only 4x earnings. The firm buys $10 million in new earnings for just $40 million. The math seems simple, but the associates in the room are not performing simple addition. They are performing alchemy. By legally binding the small clinics to the large platform, the entire combined entity is suddenly treated as a regional powerhouse. The financial gravity shifts completely, and the local vet clinic is no longer valued as a local business. The conversation between the private equity sponsor and the valuation auditor is a masterclass in aggressive accounting. We bought the bolt-ons at 4x, the sponsor says, pointing to the spreadsheet, but they are now fully integrated into the platform. You have to mark the entire combined entity at the platform multiple of 10x. The auditor, whose firm is collecting massive advisory fees from the sponsor, agrees without hesitation. The result is staggering. The $40 million spent on the bolt-ons is instantly transformed on paper into $100 million in enterprise value. The private equity firm has manufactured $60 million in phantom equity out of thin air, simply by changing the corporate structure. They did not invent a new product. They did not cure a canine disease. They simply combined two different spreadsheets and applied a larger multiplier to the bottom line. This is multiple arbitrage. It is the engine that drives the entire roll-up economy, allowing massive holding companies to borrow against value that does not practically exist. To truly understand multiple arbitrage, imagine a technique we can call the Frankenstein valuation. You go to a butcher and buy 10 pounds of cheap, discarded beef trimmings for $2 a pound. You take all $20 worth of this cheap meat and stuff it into a single, premium gold foil casing. You then slap a Wagyu Prime sticker on the giant sausage and sell it to a blindfolded institutional investor for $150 a pound. You claim that because it is now a larger, unified piece of meat, the molecular structure of the cheap trimmings has magically transformed into a premium steak. The blindfolded investor, usually a private credit fund desperate for yield, believes you. They hand you the cash. This is exactly what happens when 20 local dentists are bundled together. The individual clinics have not improved. In fact, their localized care has likely deteriorated under corporate cost-cutting. But because they are wrapped in a single holding company casing, the credit markets treat them like a premium, risk-free asset. To supercharge this multiple arbitrage, the firms introduce a concept called Forma Adjusted Earnings. When applying for hundreds of millions in loans, the company does not report its actual cash flow. Instead, they add back expected future savings to their current ledger. They take their real earnings and add back $2 million in synergized supply chain savings that have not happened yet. They add back $1.5 million in one-time integration costs that are actually recurring every quarter. Suddenly, the lender is underwriting a loan based on an inflated, hypothetical earnings number. The company borrows 6 times this fantasy number, securing immense amounts of debt based on savings that will never materialize. The holding company is now massively over-leveraged, balancing a mountain of debt on the shoulders of local veterinarians and dentists. The trap is perfectly set. The only thing required to keep the illusion alive is an environment where money is completely free, and institutional lenders ask 0 questions about actual cash flow. October 11th, 2018. KKR Headquarters, 9 West 57th Street, New York City, 41st floor. The air conditioning is set to a crisp 68 degrees, The panoramic view of Central Park is entirely ignored by a room of associates modeling the $9.9 billion leveraged buyout of Envision Healthcare. The room is littered with empty salad bowls and cooling espresso cups. Spreadsheets on ultra-wide monitors are being aggressively manipulated. An associate manually types in a line item labeled Pro Forma Run Rate Synergies to artificially inflate the earnings by $150 million. This single keystroke unlocks an additional $800 million in debt capacity from the private credit markets. There is an atmosphere of absolute invincibility inside the boardroom. This is the peak of the golden age for private equity roll-ups. The Federal Reserve has kept interest rates pinned near zero. Money is functionally free, and the pursuit of scale has replaced the pursuit of operational reality. The only metric that matters is the speed of acquisition. A recorded phone transcript from a private credit syndication call regarding similar healthcare debt reveals the mindset of the era. A skeptical junior analyst asks about the actual cash flow of the clinics. The senior managing director shuts him down immediately. "We do not care about the true, unadjusted cash flow today," the director states. "We are underwriting to the multiple expansion. Print the debt, syndicate it by Friday. The market will swallow anything with a yield." The lenders were sitting on $1.7 trillion in undeployed dry powder. They needed places to park that capital. So they willingly abandoned basic financial safety rails, issuing covenant-light loans. These specialized loans removed traditional triggers that would allow lenders to seize the company if financial health deteriorated. It allowed the roll-ups to quietly bleed out operationally without ever triggering a formal, legal default. The banks essentially handed over billions of dollars and contractually agreed to close their eyes, trusting that the private equity sponsors would act as a permanent backstop. The reason the sponsors acted so recklessly comes down to human incentives and a maneuver called the dividend recapitalization. General partners at private equity firms charge a 2% annual fee on committed capital. Their primary incentive is to deploy capital as fast as humanly possible to justify raising a larger fund next year. But they also take 20% of the profits. They do not want to wait 7 years to sell the roll-up to get their bonus. By executing a dividend recapitalization, they load the newly acquired medical practice with aggressive debt and use that borrowed money to pay themselves a special, massive dividend. The private equity managers pull out their initial equity investment and lock in their profits by year 3. Think of it as the ultimate financial getaway car. They take the cash, buy a yacht, and leave the local business to figure out how to pay a massive mortgage on a minimum wage salary. The risk is completely asymmetric. Heads, the sponsor wins. Tails, the local community loses. This scam required a synchronized orchestra of highly paid enablers looking the other way. The major valuation firms generated hundreds of millions in fees by signing off on the quality of earnings reports. They were financially incentivized to rubber stamp the absurd adjusted add-backs. If an auditor rejected a phantom synergy, the holding company simply took its lucrative advisory business to a competing auditor. Credit rating agencies granted favorable ratings to roll-ups with dangerous leverage, like 7x debt to earnings, because they baked in sponsor support. This was an unwritten assumption that the deep-pocketed private equity firm would write a bailout check if the company stumbled. It was an ecosystem built entirely on faith, engineered to keep the debt flowing smoothly. But ecosystems built on 0% interest rates possess a fatal vulnerability. They require the macroeconomic weather to remain perfectly calm. And, as the calendar rolled forward, the storm clouds were gathering over the debt markets. Someone was finally going to ask a basic question about where the cash was actually coming from. September 2nd, 2016. Stonemore Partners Headquarters, Levittown, Pennsylvania. The atmosphere in the fluorescent-lit executive conference room is suffocating. Executives sit around a heavy mahogany table, staring at a muted speakerphone while waiting for equity analysts to dial in for the quarterly earnings call. A stack of SEC comment letters sits on the table, heavily highlighted in yellow ink. Outside, heat waves ripple off the asphalt parking lot. Stonemore was once the second largest owner of cemeteries and funeral homes in the United States, utilizing a leveraged roll-up model that consolidated grieving families under a massive corporate umbrella. But today, the math has stopped working. The company is about to admit that its accounting regarding deferred revenue from pre-need cemetery plots is fatally flawed. The cash generated by the local funeral homes is not enough to cover the distributions promised to the investors at the top of the holding company structure. The financial engineering has hit a physical limit. The speakerphone chimes, signaling the start of the call. The illusion is about to be punctured. 30 minutes into the presentation, the corporate speak is thick. Executives discuss macroeconomic headwinds and transitionary liquidity constraints. Then, an equity analyst on the line cuts through the noise with a devastatingly simple question. "Wait, let me make sure I clearly understand this," the analyst says. "If you are drawing down on your revolving credit facility to pay the quarterly distribution to unit holders, aren't you just borrowing money to pay a dividend? You aren't actually generating the cash from the funerals, are you?" The resulting silence on the line lasts for an agonizing 6 seconds. The executives look at each other across the mahogany table. There is no spin left. The analyst had correctly identified that the roll-up was operating like a localized Ponzi scheme, utilizing fresh debt to pay off existing equity holders because the underlying businesses were starved of actual free cash flow. When the call ended, Stonemore's market capitalization began a terminal plummet, dropping from a peak of $1.2 billion to under $50 million. To keep these dying roll-ups solvent just a little bit longer, the holding companies deploy their final weapon, the real estate strip. It is a wireframe flow known as the OpCo-PropCo split. If the local funeral home, dental office, or veterinarian owned its physical building free and clear, the private equity firm immediately splits the business into two entities, an operating company and a property company. The physical building is immediately sold to a real estate investment trust for cold, hard cash. The local clinic is left with no building and an aggressive 20-year lease with 3% annual escalators. We can call this the Matryoshka doll mortgage. The holding company extracts the cash from the real estate sale to satisfy their internal debt covenants, leaving the local doctor as a permanent bag holder. The clinic is forced to hike consumer prices by 30% just to avoid defaulting on a building they used to own outright. They strip mine the physical assets to artificially inflate the holding company's liquidity. The real estate stripping bought the industry a few more years of runway. They successfully converted the brick-and-mortar equity of thousands of small American businesses into synthetic dividends. But this entire house of cards relied on a single critical assumption: that interest rates would remain at zero forever. The holding companies had secured their multi-billion-dollar multiple arbitrage loans using floating rate debt. As long as rates stayed at zero, the interest payments were manageable, even with negative operating cash flow. But in late 2022, inflation spiked. The Federal Reserve stepped to the podium and began aggressively hiking interest rates, orchestrating the fastest tightening cycle in modern history. The floating rate debt loads tied to these local dentists and veterinarians did not just increase, they exploded. An interest payment that was $20 million a year suddenly reset to $80 million a year. The holding companies could not raise the price of a root canal fast enough to cover the spread. The math was broken. The greatest default wave in private credit history was imminent. May 15, 2023. Southern District of Texas Bankruptcy Court, Houston, Texas. The hum of server racks and the sterile echo of a half-empty federal courtroom set the stage. Lawyers in $3,000 suits stand rigidly at podiums, shuffling reams of Chapter 11 declarations. The Federal Reserve has just hiked interest rates for the 10th consecutive time. Envision Healthcare's floating rate debt obligations have detonated, eating 100% of the company's operating cash flow. The realization hits the unsecured creditors committee like a physical blow. The assets, the actual medical practices scattered across the country, are functionally worthless without the doctors. And the doctors, burned out by quotas and starved of resources, are already threatening to quit. The pro forma synergies never existed. The multiple arbitrage was a mirage. Envision filed for bankruptcy to wipe out $7.7 billion in debt. The equity holders, including the massive private equity sponsors, watched their entire $3.5 billion equity investment get written down to absolute zero in a single afternoon. The sworn Chapter 11 declaration of the Chief Restructuring Officer, Paul Keglevic, read like an autopsy report of the entire roll-up era. He stood before the court and stated for the record, "The debtors face significant liquidity constraints, driven by a confluence of factors, including rising interest rates on the debtors' floating rate debt, which increased the annualized interest expense by hundreds of millions of dollars, leaving the enterprise with an unsustainable capital structure." The translation is brutal. The holding company borrowed too much money to buy local clinics at inflated prices. And when the cost of that money went up, the entire machine seized. That unwritten assumption from the rating agencies, the idea of sponsor support, vanished instantly. The deep-pocketed private equity firms did not write a bailout check. They looked at the collapsing math, walked away from the burning building, and handed the keys to the distressed debt lenders. The localized monopoly they built could no longer fund its own existence, leaving communities with hollowed-out medical infrastructure and terrified staff. The fallout from the Envision collapse triggered a systemic panic within the $1.2 trillion collateralized loan obligation market. These CLOs held roughly 60% of Envision's leveraged loans. When Envision defaulted, the managers of these massive debt pools were forced into emergency portfolio rebalancing. They had to prevent breaching their own over-collateralization tests. If those tests failed, the cash flows to the equity tranches of the CLOs would shut off entirely, causing a cascading liquidity crisis across Wall Street. The panic spread immediately to veterinary roll-ups and funeral homes. Private credit lenders, suddenly terrified of their massive floating rate exposure, slammed the brakes on issuing new debt. Without a constant injection of new, cheap debt to acquire more clinics, the serial acquisition model stalled completely. The multiple arbitrage engine died. Holding companies were forced into massive internal layoffs and aggressive price gouging at local vets, just to service the debt they already had. By the fourth quarter of 2023, rating agencies downgraded over $40 billion in roll-up loans to deep junk status. The era of zero-interest rate roll-ups in healthcare had violently ended. Clinics were liquidated, rebranded under distressed sales, or left to rot under crushing lease agreements from the real estate stripping phase. But remember the mechanics of the dividend recapitalization. The tragedy of this crash was that the architects of the disaster were insulated from the blast radius. By the time Envision and Stonemore collapsed, many of the general partners at the private equity firms had already extracted their massive management fees and special dividends. They had gotten paid on the illusion of scale years before reality caught up with the balance sheet. The local businesses, the patients, and the pension funds holding the toxic debt were left holding the bag. As the bankruptcies piled up in federal courts in Texas and Delaware, federal regulators finally decided it was time to step in. But by the time the government began issuing subpoenas and connecting the dots of these localized monopolies, the private equity machine had already found its next unregulated target. September 21st, 2023. Federal Trade Commission Headquarters, Washington, D.C. Stacks of subpoenas are being aggressively boxed up for transport. Litigators are analyzing thousands of transaction records on massive whiteboards, connecting red strings between Welsh Carson, a massive private equity firm, and dozens of small, local anesthesia practices in Texas. The map looks less like a corporate strategy and more like a cartel distribution network. Shredders are ostensibly quiet in this federal building, but the litigators know they are running at full speed in corporate legal departments across Manhattan. For a decade, the government had missed the stealth roll-up strategy entirely, focusing only on massive, headline-grabbing corporate mergers. They ignored the quiet acquisition of individual local practices. Now, they were trying to unwind a monopoly that had already entrenched itself into the fabric of localized healthcare. The FTC was preparing a massive antitrust lawsuit, attempting to prove that buying up 50 tiny clinics in a single zip code was just as illegal as two megacorporations merging. The era of regulatory blind spots was supposedly closing. The official statement from FTC Chair Lina Khan upon filing the federal antitrust lawsuit pulled no punches. She stood before the press and delivered a fatal assessment of the multiple arbitrage strategy. Private equity firm Welsh Carson engineered a multi-year anti-competitive consolidation scheme, she stated, buying up nearly every large anesthesia practice in Texas to corner the market and jack up prices. These tactics, often executed under the radar through stealth roll-ups, are illegal, and the FTC will not hesitate to dismantle them. It was a direct declaration of war against the holding company model. The government had finally recognized that the massive price hikes at the local doctor were not the result of standard inflation, but the mathematical requirement of servicing over-leveraged floating-rate debt. The FTC lawsuit sent a shockwave through the private equity industry. The traditional model of stealthily consolidating a localized medical market was suddenly radioactive. The risk of federal prosecution was too high. But the private equity machine does not stop. It simply reallocates its capital to a path of lesser resistance. The secret to the entire stealth roll-up strategy relies on evading the Hart-Scott-Rodino antitrust threshold. The FTC requires companies to report mergers only if the transaction value exceeds a specific threshold, historically hovering around $111 million. Because a local plumber, a neighborhood daycare, or a regional HVAC repair company is typically purchased for $3 million to $10 million, the transaction flies completely under the radar. The private equity firm can buy 200 small businesses in a single city, achieving an absolute price-gouging monopoly without ever filing a single piece of paperwork with federal antitrust regulators. They bypass the federal government via a technicality in the transaction size. The FTC had caught on to the scheme in the healthcare and veterinary space because the sheer scale of the bankruptcies and the Medicaid fraud forced them to look. But the mechanics of the Hart-Scott-Rodino loophole remained fully intact, completely legal, and highly operational. The holding companies just needed an industry that regulators were not paying any attention to. The private equity machine has quietly pivoted. They are exploiting the exact same regulatory blind spot, but this time the target is the unregulated frontier of home services. They are executing stealth roll-ups of local HVAC repair companies, roofing contractors, plumbers, and local daycares for $3 million to $10 million apiece. By the time you realize your trusted local mechanic or plumber is actually a heavily leveraged derivative product owned by a Manhattan holding company, the prices have doubled, the veteran staff has quit, and the real estate has been sold out from under them. The infection has simply mutated, moving from your dentist to your living room. The next time you call for a roof repair and the quote seems mathematically disconnected from reality, remember the multiple arbitrage. The debt must be fed. We will keep tracking these roll-ups as they spread into your neighborhood. Subscribing ensures you see the unseen architecture of the modern economy before it arrives at your front door. The holding companies are expanding. Make sure you are paying attention.